Hey nerds, what's up? If you've been following me on Instagram, you'll know that I'm about to make this trilogy my whole new personality. Yes, I finally finished the whole First Law 10 books in the series, ending with the Age of Madness Trilogy. And to say I am obsessed with all three of these books is an understatement. In fact, I gave each of these books in this trilogy 5 stars, which is so rare for me that I don't actually think it's ever happened. It certainly has never happened in the 3 years I have been working on this channel. And I kept trying to think back, like, is there any trilogy I have ever given every book 5 stars? Now I have a ton of trilogies that are my favorite of all time, trilogies I love, but usually one of those books get a 4 or 4.5. The only one I can maybe think that I would retroactively give 5 to each one before I was like reviewing books, maybe Lord of the Rings? Have to think about it. Needless to say, this is my first 5-star trilogy on this channel, and that needs to be celebrated. Age of Madness, I think, is Joe Abercrombie at his best, and we're gonna talk about that today, along with my experience reading the books and the themes that he explores so excellently in this trilogy, and also a discussion on the standalone nature of this trilogy, or if you should keep reading the First Law, because it's a question I get a lot when I express my love for this Age of Madness trilogy, so we'll have a little discussion about that. And then finally at the end, we will have a bit of a spoiler discussion about some of my thoughts of this trilogy. So the first 3 parts of this video will be non-spoilery, so you can feel free to watch if you haven't started the Age of Madness yet, and I will give you ample warning before we go into spoiler territory. So without further ado, see you after the jump. You may hear a lot of people say that the Age of Madness trilogy is Joe Abercrombie at his best, and I completely agree, and I think there are 2 primary reasons why, and I've categorized them as character work and plot/pacing. Look, Joe Abercrombie's character work has always been incredible. It's the reason I kept reading First Law, even when I had some issues with the first trilogy, because I was so taken aback at how good he was at writing characters, and particularly character voice and dialogue. So it's not a small thing when I say somehow Age of Madness makes characters even better. They are more subtle, they are more nuanced, they have more layers to them, more deep and interesting dynamics, and I feel like that's crazy to say, because he is already so good at it. But somehow every character comes together in this book, including the most side characters. At one point at the end, when I was reading Wisdom of Crowds, I was like, is there a single minor side character I don't care about at this point? Because he just somehow nailed every personality, even when they're on the smallest bit of screen. Like, I found myself caring about these very minor characters, like giving me an intense emotional response. And I feel like that's just such a testament that Abercrombie has literally dialed down and just like perfected what he was already good at. And I found some characters that reappeared in this trilogy from previous books that I may not have been super interested in. All of a sudden, I was deeply connected to them. And I'll say which characters those are in the spoiler section, but obviously I don't want to say, who survives from the main trilogy. It's also interesting to me because I know that Abercrombie himself has criticized how he wrote female characters in the First Law trilogy, particularly Artie. He says he felt like he could have done a better job with her. That's always funny to me because I actually really liked Artie. I thought his female characters were very well written because, I mean, it's Abercrombie, he writes good characters. But I have to say, after reading Age of Madness, they're like so much better. He really nailed it, and I think it's because he also upped the main characters that were female. So I think if that was a goal of his, he totally succeeded, and I really liked how he handled his female characters in Age of Madness. And I find that Abercrombie has always been really good at kind of putting a twist on classic characters, but one I want to particularly call out is Savine in this book, because Savine is kind of one of those characters that is the one who's always a step ahead, who is like extra smart and can always kind of figure out the enemy's next move. And while I usually like those characters, I do find often in fantasy and sci-fi they can be a little overdone to stretch believability. Like, I was personally thinking, this is gonna get me in trouble. I started reading the Thrawn trilogy, which was great. I totally understand why they're so beloved. People love Thrawn because he's a super smart character. I found it just like slightly stretching my believability. And maybe that will get better as I read more books. And that's just an example. I see that a lot in fantasy. I thought Abercrombie did such a good job with Savine as being one of those characters, but in such a believable, down-to-earth, realistic way that I had to call it out. I think she was just so well done. The second part is plotting. Now, I know the fandom's kind of divided because one criticism that's often said about the First Law trilogy is that it has no plot. There's like a 50-50, I find, if people agree with that or disagree with that. I personally disagree with that. I don't think the First Law has no plot, but I do believe the First Law is paced very differently than most fantasy. And some people might be like, well, that's a good thing, it's different. Well, I think there's like a reason we expect certain plot pacing moments or certain plot structures in a novel. And I think sometimes the First Law doesn't always follow those. Now, because the character work was so good, I was fine with that. It never bothered me. But I do understand that as a criticism of the First Law because I do think it's there. Now that plot pacing issue is completely gone in my opinion in Age of Madness. Abercrombie found a way to balance his intense character work and motivations with a plot that just feels a little more natural, a little better paced, a little more action without taking away what makes First Law good. And so I was very impressed. Like, I think Abercrombie has actually increased in skill at being able to write the kind of major plot moments that move the book along. And as such, these books really didn't have a lull for me in the way that the First Law trilogy often did. Okay, let's talk about themes because I've always been very interested in Abercrombie's themes. And one thing I am happy to say is that I made a video after I'd only read the first 3 books, so the First Law trilogy, about the anti-hero's journey and how Abercrombie turns the hero's journey on its head and kind of makes things circular where everyone ends back in the same spot instead of growing. And at the time I was like, well, this is what I see now. Hopefully I'm right. I can now say after reading all 10 books, I nailed it, just saying. That theme is, I could have put all of these books in that video and it would have totally worked. And I actually love that. I love that Abercrombie kept to that theme and how I saw it repeatedly in this book. I thought it was done very well. Particularly at the end of this book, there is a scene between 2 characters that heavily mirrors a scene at the beginning of The Blade itself. And that mirroring with this scene at the beginning of The Blade itself and near the very end of Wisdom of Crowds was just like a perfect full circle moment that exemplified how Abercrombie writes characters that can just never escape this circle. And I just really enjoyed how Abercrombie tied up those themes. And I thought it was very impressive how he was able to make it make sense in this trilogy as a standalone, but also make sense in the wider context of all 10 of his books. That may seem like a small thing. It was something that I thought made Age of Madness that much better for me personally. Okay, the next thing I want to quickly talk about is kind of like this, should I read this? Or how should I read this? I've just been getting a lot of questions recently, either from people who are like, hey, I read The Blade itself and I wasn't super into it, but now I'm seeing you gush over Age of Madness. Should I keep going? Or I don't understand how there's 10 books in this series. Can you help me out? So just like a brief overview, there are 10 books in the First Law universe, but not like a typical series where you kind of have to read them all in order. What it's made up of is a first trilogy called the First Law Trilogy. Then there are 3 standalones and a short story collection. And then there is the second trilogy, the Age of Madness Trilogy. Now, according to Lord Grimdark himself, any of these can be a starting point. They are written to be an entry point at any time. You can start with Age of Madness. You can start with First Law Trilogy. You can start with any of the standalones. Now, if you want the best reading order or the best advice on different starting points, I would look to Leanna's library video on this. She's obviously my First Law expert, and she has similar opinions to how I feel about it. So if you want an in-depth dive, please go view her video. We'll show it here. I will link it below. She's really your go-to. But I will say this. I don't think you should start with Age of Madness. You absolutely can. Joe Abercrombie has put enough information in these books so that you will not be missing anything for the main plot. I just think there are several things that will be very underwhelming in Age of Madness if you do not have the prior context, particularly in my opinion of the First Law Trilogy. I personally feel like you could read the First Law Trilogy and immediately skip to Age of Madness and be okay, but I particularly think there's stuff in this book that either spoils or shows you things that it'd be much, much better if you had the First Law Trilogy as context. That's just my basic opinion. Now, what about the other one? I'm struggling with The Blade itself. Should I read it? It's gonna depend on why you're struggling with the blade itself. If you're struggling with the blade itself because you don't feel like it has enough plot, but you're really enjoying the character work, I really encourage you to just keep reading. If the blade itself was fine and you're just not really sure what it's about, but it was fine enough, it didn't take you forever to read, please keep continuing. I wasn't really convinced on the First Law for a little bit. My journey was, I read the First Law trilogy. Well, first, sorry, let me go back for a second. Just in case you're new here. I have zero problem stopping a series at any point. If I read the first book and I don't like it, if I even give it like 3 stars, if I'm just like, I most likely won't continue the series. I got too much going on in my life. I don't DNF books, so I'll DNF series very easily. I have DNF series after 2 books, after 3 books. I will stop at any time if I am no longer enjoying it. So, I got through the First Law trilogy, which means I enjoyed it enough to continue. But I wasn't like super sold. I was like, yeah, I enjoyed that. It's never gonna be in my top books. Then I read the standalone Best Served Cold. Didn't like Best Served Cold really. I mean, I gave it 3 stars, so it was average. Then I took a huge break actually. In fact, I should go see how long it was. And I read The Heroes because I wanted to give it a try. Loved The Heroes. And all of a sudden everything clicked for me in Abercrombie, and then I read the next stuff in a much shorter period of time. I just raced through it and loved it. So I think it's possible for you to not be convinced about the series and like it later, but you have to be enjoying the journey enough to make it work. If it's too depressing for you, if it's too violent for you, if you're really not vibing with that, that's never gonna get better. I don't think you should read it, because if like you didn't like those things about the First Law trilogy, you're not gonna like the same things in Age of Madness. It's not gonna fix anything. Does that make sense? That being said, overall, I am always a publication order girly. So that's the way I always read things. That's the way I always recommend, because publication order can never be wrong. Okay, finally, let's move on to a spoiler section. So if you have not read Age of Madness and I've convinced you in the last section that you need to keep going, please turn off the video now, because these are very big spoilers. In this spoiler section, I mostly want to talk about the ending of Wisdom of Crowds, just because that's the thing I have the most to talk about. This is, I would say, the ending of Wisdom of Crowds is the only thing that I have like a few nitpicky things about that I didn't love. I feel torn about the ending because there were some parts of the ending that I thought were incredible and some parts of the ending that like I still have questions about. As far as incredible, Orso's death scene, I knew Orso would die. Somehow was still not prepared. It made me really sad in a way that no deaths previously in the First Law have made me sad, because we always know that people are gonna die and it's kind of depressing. And so because it elicited that emotional reaction, I feel like it's another testament that Abercrombie really like nailed it with his characters. It was just like such a heartbreaking scene and it was so excellent. I also want to talk about Gorst's death scene, which may be my favorite scene in like any of the books. Gorst is so funny because I loved The Heroes, but Gorst, being in his head, man, it was so hard being in his head. Like, you want to love him, but also like, oh, he's kind of gross. But oh man, what a redemption for me. I just slowly after The Heroes started liking Gorst more and more. And the ending symmetry of like, from Best Served Cold the whole time. Like, and that's definitely a journey I feel like you just couldn't understand unless you read everything in order. You know, when he tells Leo, send your regards to your mother, which both is the perfect thing to piss off Leo. Like, love that because Leo, man. And then also is like this callback, and he gets to redeem himself by trying to save Orso and believing he did. 10 out of 10. Like, what a scene. I love Rika's ending vision and how she ends up not telling everyone about it and how depressing it is and showing what it's gonna be. I already talked, the scene I was talking about earlier is when Clover goes to see Baez at the library. What a great mirror of the scene of Blade itself when Logan is coming to see Baez, and how those mirror each other, and how Clover and Logan, they aren't similar characters, but they're both characters that are likable and seem good, but we know have like a lot of issues and a lot of stuff in their past. And they're seeing Baez in the exact same moment, giving us this idea that the circle's gonna start again. Like, oh, what great symmetry. But there were some things I felt a little hollow about as an ending of the trilogy. And the first is that I don't think we saw Baez enough. I needed like 2 more scenes with Baez. Not a lot, like I know he's not someone that's gonna be super on screen, But I just felt like while all this was going on and clearly an effort to make Bayaz lose power, I wanted to see a couple scenes of where was he during this? What was he doing to hold on to power? And how was he feeling about this and how was he fighting back? I don't think what we heard from, oh my gosh, his eater companion, Sulfur. Oh my gosh, I just like totally off my head. Sulfur, it wasn't enough for me. Bayaz is period, one of my favorite villains of all time, period. I love him as a villain. He's been very behind the scenes, which makes him so scary. So I understand not wanting to over put him on screen because then, you know, you lose the fear. But I think the series needed it. I think he needed to be a little bit more present. So I'd be really curious about your guys' opinion on that. Second, and this one's really small, I was really bummed we didn't get one more scene with Durand and Leo. Their whole dance had been set up for this entire trilogy. Like from the very beginning, we see this progression of Durand and Leo's relationship. And so when I see Savine tell Durand all this information about Leo, I'm ready for that scene, you know? And we never get it. And it's the one thing that felt really unfinished to me. Like, I need some sort of conversation between Durand and Leo with the realization now that they both know how they feel about each other. It really disappointed me that I didn't get to see that. So those two things left me feeling a little like, on the ending, it like wasn't quite enough. I'd love to know what you guys think about that. I know Joe Abercrombie's taken a break for a while from First Law, but apparently he may return. So there's a chance if he returns that he picks up, you know, 20 years in the future again or 30 years in the future and we'll get some of that blowback. But yeah, I'm very curious what you thought of Wizards of Crowd's ending because it wasn't quite what I expected. In conclusion, Age of Madness was fantastic. Every book 5 stars. I loved it. It actually made me kind of eager to go back and reread specifically the First Law trilogy and Best Served Cold, which were the books I was the most unsure about in my journey. I'm 100% positive things will have changed for me, how I view those, particularly Best Served Cold because it was sold to me as this girl power book for Monza. But now that I'm so in love with Shivers, I think reading Best Served Cold as a Shivers book would be more interesting. So curious about that. Overall, if you've been on the fence about Joe Abercrombie, I just really recommend trying it. I do not consider myself a grimdark girly, and I still don't consider myself a lover of grimdark, to be honest. I've tried other ones, didn't like it. I am a Joe Abercrombie believer. So I think at least everyone should give him a try. See what you think. Let me know what you thought about Age of Madness if you read it, if I convinced you to give it a try. All your thoughts, please let me know in the comments below. And if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.